Well, thank you very much. So, and thank you for having me here and for using your Saturday on this. I've really looked forward to presenting this. So this is nonlinearities in intergenerational income mobility, the role of employment, education, and public transfers, and it's joined with Anders Hjort. Okay. So why is income mobility estimated to be high in some places and low in others? So this is a question that's been studied for decades by a very large literature. And it's also a very active literature. So there's a new working paper article on this topic, if not every month, then several every year. And of course, at the end of the day, we want to relate the different mobility estimates to underlying causal mechanisms. So that could be transmissions and skills between parents and children. That could be the influence of the surrounding environment, peers, institution, and policies, so forth. Of course, there's also focus on how to estimate the mobility. So for instance, so when should we measure children's income? So for which age groups should we do it? So should we consider ranks, logs, or more fundamentally, how should we think about mobility estimates and mobility more generally, as we also discussed yesterday? However, a question which has received relatively little attention is how income is actually measured. So when I say income, what do I mean? And how does this income measurement then proxy a given mechanism for a given country? And how does this depend on the type of family we look at? So do we look at low income families, high income families? And how does this shape income mobility differences between different groups? And that is what we'll study in this paper. So the final point here. So we'll study heterogeneity in income mobility estimates in Denmark. So we will use full population register data with detailed information on income sources, education, and employment. And first, we'll estimate income mobility across parental income levels. So instead of finding an estimate of, say, 0.3, just for Denmark, then we'll say that, okay, what is income mobility then for children who grow up in, say, low-income families, and then middle-income families, and high-income families? And does that differ? Then we'll ask whether the association between children's income and parents' income, how that is explained by different components. So for instance, is the association between parents and children's income explained by employment variation in some parts, and then perhaps education in other parts? And we'll do the same basically for different income types. So when we say that there's an association between children's and parents' income, is that then driven by wage earnings or capital income or transfer income, etc.? And then finally, we'll use these 3 points and the findings we have there to assess differences in income mobility between two groups. So here we're going to use gender differences as the example. So we're going to consider differences in income mobility for sons and their parents relative to daughters and their parents. And the reason we look at gender differences is because that for most groups, when you look at, when you consider those and you say condition on income levels, so we could look at native Danes and immigrants, for instance. For a low income group, those two groups would just differ. So native Danes and immigrants. That is not the case for genders. So when we look at gender differences, the only thing that we actually vary is quote unquote, the things on the left-hand side. So that is the income of the child, really. So we can basically see how much does then the way we measure income of the child then drive the differences here. Okay, so just to preview the findings, what we find is that mobility estimates, when we consider market income, so that is wage earnings, capital income, self-employment income, business income, that varies strongly across parental income levels. So from estimates of local IGEs of around 0.15 to around 0.5. However, when we include transfers in our income measure, this variation is almost eliminated. So this relates first to Blasberg et al., who study income mobility for different countries, but consider nonlinearities, but also to my own paper with Jim Heckman, where we also consider nonlinear IGEs for different income types. So we extend this by then considering what explains the association between parents and children's income for different income levels of parents. So what we find is that for children who grew up with low income parents, it is mainly variation to their employment that explains the association between their parents' income and then their own income. But as parental income increases, education explains an increasing proportion. So education becomes increasingly important as a mechanism or a mediator for children's income. However, All of this was estimated again using market income, so where we don't consider transfers, but when we do include transfers, then they mute the role of employment and education, basically implying that there's again less variation across parental levels, but also that that the role of employment for children from low-income families basically disappears, and similarly, the importance of education also is eliminated basically because returns to education when we include transfer income and consider that instead, it's much lower. So this is important for both for studies that consider differences in mobility between countries and also for studies that consider differences in mobility within countries. If we start with the within country comparison, so imagine that I was to compare an estimate for an affluent area in Denmark and a disadvantaged area in Denmark. The mobility estimate may be similar. Then I may say, well, there's no differences. But what the one estimate would be driven by was basically children's education, whereas the other would be driven by children's employment. So two very different mechanisms, basically, even though that the overall estimates look quite similar. Similarly, if we compare mobility estimates across countries, so say that we take Denmark where transfers are generous, and then we take another countries where transfers are less generous. So that could be the US, or it could be, say, the UK. So we say that we formally define income in the same way. So we take gross income, include transfers, so we measure it in exactly the same way. But the IGE estimates, or any other estimates really, are going to differ simply because the transfer levels differ. So we've basically muted the role of children's employment and education to different degrees, simply because the transfer levels and institutions in the two countries differ. And we will also find that this drives the differences or similarities between the groups when we consider different males and females. So focusing on market income, we'll find substantial differences between their mobility, intergenerational mobility. However, once we then consider gross income instead and include transfers, then we have muted the role of employment and returns to education. And then basically we find no differences whatsoever.
Rasmus, can I ask you a clarifying question?
Yes.
And that is, are you conditioning at all on education? So you think something like employment for children, say you're muting the role of education, you're going to define it, I guess. But I mean, the role of education would be exactly in securing employment. And it could also be important in securing transfers, not only through eligibility, but also through access and understanding of how to game the system. So I don't know what you're going to show us. I'm just wondering, is this going to be like a mediation analysis, or are you just giving us a direct, a direct decomposition of the outcomes?
So it's the latter, but just to get to your point in terms of education and employment. So of course education and employment in terms of explaining the outcome has a component, right? So part of the importance of education goes through, I mean, whether or not I have a job. So the way the results that I will show you here, we have taken the role of education as also including the channel through employment. But overall, the importance of employment for low-income families and then the importance of education for high-income families doesn't really depend on that. If we did it the other way around, then it would basically be the same result. In terms of transfers, in terms of gaming the system and transfer levels, yes, but you have to think of many transfers in Denmark. They're basically, if you don't have a job, you're eligible for transfers, more or less everyone. So it's not like you need a strong institutional knowledge to, for instance, get unemployment benefits or social assistance. So if you want, for instance, to transition from social assistance into disability insurance, there may be, as for instance, the Norwegian study of disability insurance and between generations there. But in terms of transfers in Denmark and gaining transfers, that's not something that at least we find to be particularly important. Okay. Okay, so we use full population register data on cohorts born from 72 to 84. We only use native Danes, consider native Danes, and that gives us around 650,000 observations. We measure children's income as the average income between age 31 and 34, and we measure parental income as the average income between when the child was 8 to 14. So really, these age categories is a compromise. Of course, we would like to have as large a time span as possible, but since we also have the cohort window where we will also consider differences across time in terms of cohorts, we have income data from 1980 to 2018. So that basically gives 34 here as the last year, and then 8 here as the earliest year that we can then measure parental income and children's income respectively. That being said, that if we then cut cohorts differently, say that we took 74 to 82, so we could use a wider time span in terms of income, it wouldn't change our results really. So our conclusions are completely identical to that. So that doesn't change results. Okay, so we focus on 2 types of income, broadly speaking. So what I have called market income, that is wage earnings plus business income and self-employment income, and then capital income. So capital income, that could be dividends to stocks, bonds, etc. We also consider what I call total gross income, which is then market income plus all public transfers. So that is direct transfers, so unemployment benefits, pensions, social assistance, child support, parental leave support, but not in-kind transfers, so not the value of public schools or hospitals, etc.
So Rasmus, can I interrupt for a second? So you're looking at kids in their early 30s. Mm-hmm. Since your analysis is kind of thinking about types of income, should we be worried at all about how this changes over the life cycle? Like if we measure this at age 48 versus 31, this kind of decomposition of the type of income?
Well, to some extent, yeah, I guess that for instance, capital income, as you also see, is basically non-existent for everyone who's not from a very affluent family, and that probably relates to also the age where we measure the children, for instance. So if we take people at age 50, then more will have some type of capital income in terms of stocks or etc. But in terms of the overall conclusions, so what it then explains variation in the bottom. I mean, if we increase the sample, as I said, to I mean, meaningfully a few years, so we could also take up to the late 30s. That doesn't change the estimate. But yes, if we take a completely different part of the life cycle, then I guess that we would give a different estimate. However, I can't quantify that change because basically, as I said, we need to have an overlap in terms of children and parents within the income data window from 1980 to 2018. So it will basically be hard to assess in that sense the role of us measuring income at say age 48. I hope that addressed your question.
Rasmus,
yeah.
May I ask why you're not deducting direct taxes if you're including public transfers?
So it's true. So taxes is also, so that's something that you can then add to the analysis basically. I mean, yeah. So we can consider disposable income as well. So right now we have market income here, and then we have the first part of the redistribution, which is then basically what you get in transfers, and then the second part will then be what you paid in taxes. So basically the overall questions, and to keep it relatively simple, we only consider these 2 margins, then see how that varies. But you're completely right that a separate and an interesting question would then be basically to do the same, where we then consider how it also varies when we have the last part of the redistribution in as well.
Rasmus, can I just build on some of these comments? The question I think Bash asked before, and that is, what about the asset income and things like bequests? In particular, children of entrepreneurs are likely to be the ones who are going to inherit the business, or at least have some stake in it, and also government pensions that would show up. I mean, that's off the table here completely, right? And yet there's data showing a lot of occupational persistence, right? Where if the father built a factory, then the child inherits the factory in one way or the other, and so forth. And that's not included here in any kind of, that's another source of linking at the high end, right? So,
yeah, sure. So what we'll see here with the particular capital income is that is basically driven by wealth transfers between generations. So you'll see when I get to it in the bullet called income types on top, that is basically for the very affluent families that drives the mobility estimates, and we also see that in the data that basically the assets of these children for higher income families, that they basically exist even when they're say 22 or 20, or even when they're children, so age 15. So you can basically see, so it has to relate to to transfers of wealth, which also goes back to say the study also from Denmark by Bostrup, Klein and Kopchak, who show that that is exactly the case for these affluent families. In terms of the transfer in terms of businesses and occupations between, say, entrepreneurs. Yes, so there is a life cycle dimension to this that we do not capture fully, and where we would need a more, I would say, both expanded time window, but also I would say a more elaborate model to capture that completely. Okay. So just to say that finally about the data, so we have also information on education, so years of schooling, and then also labor market status, and of course as I said, that in Denmark, if you don't have a job, then you're basically entitled to some type of transfer. So almost everyone are. So non-employment is then many different things. So there's an entire welfare system where you can get everything from social assistance to unemployment benefits to sick leave, support to rehabilitations to whatever. So what we will also look at is then each of these margins between employment and then the respective states in the welfare system, and then what explains the association between children's and parents' income there. Yeah. So of course, as we also discussed yesterday, many different measures of mobility exist. So we have, for instance, the IGE, the intergenerational income elasticity, so the rank of children's log income on parents' log income, rank estimates, so the rank of children's income on parents' income rank, upward mobility, so do children have a high income than their parents? So importantly, first of all, the main notion that employment seems to be what is explaining the association between children's and parents' income in the bottom and education in the top basically holds for all these different methods. But I'm gonna focus in the presentation here today on the IGEs, and there are gonna be two reasons for that. The first is that when we talk about decomposing in particular in relation to different income types, when we have a measure that's based on actual income, we can do it pretty precisely, right? So my income is $100, so that is, say, $80 wage earnings plus $20 capital income. We can't really do that with ranks. So we can't say that my income rank is 50. So that is because my wage earnings rank is 60, and then my capital income rank is 40, and then the average is 50. That's unfortunately how it works. So that's one reason. The second reason is when we consider nonlinearities, the transformation of the income distribution, where we go from a highly skewed and distribution with white tails to a uniform distribution that drives the nonlinearities. Specifically, you can basically see it if you visualize these rank plots, where you have almost linearity in the middle of the plots, but then in the tails you have this S shape. So that is basically because the difference between the income levels, say between the first and the second and third percentiles, are just much larger than the differences we have between the 49th, the 50th, and the 51st percentiles. So if we did this analysis, and we've also done it, but if we looked at ranks instead, then the nonlinearities would just be basically given by our estimation strategy. So we consider as the main part here IGEs and how that vary then across parents' income distribution. Okay. So the figure here shows children's log income plotted against parents' log income, and we focus here on market income for both generations. So the IGE is then the straight line here. But what you can also see is that for different levels of parental income, the slopes are actually quite different from the overall straight line. So down here, it's much flatter, and then it becomes steeper, and then it becomes flatter again. So what we'll do is we'll then, as Jim and I also did earlier, is we'll then estimate local linear regressions at different points. So we'll basically get a local IGE for different income levels of parents. What I will also do in the presentation here, I will also simply just split the sample by parental income quartiles, because when we, for instance, talking about the different transfer schemes, do a decomposition where we have, say, 16, 20 different components, then if we had 16, 20 different lines in one figure, I mean, that would be impossible to look at. So there it would be much easier if we just split it by quartiles. But in essence, it's going to be the same results. Okay. So if we focus on these local slopes here, then this is basically what we have in this figure here. So this shows the nonlinear IGE focusing on children's market income or parents' market income. So we see that for children from low-income families, mobility, at least locally, is relatively high. Also for children from high-income families, whereas for those born in the middle of the income distribution here, we see that that it's actually relatively low. So the vertical lines here are deciles in the distribution of parental income. It's important to note here that even though that mobility here is estimated to be high, it doesn't mean that going from rags to riches is necessarily going to be likely. It's a local variation. But just to put the variation we have in this figure here, so this is within Denmark in relation to what we know from other studies. The figure to the right shows the Gatsby curve as presented by Corrick in his 2013 paper, where we then have estimates for many different countries around the West World. And basically, if you look at the variation in Denmark, so within Denmark, when we consider market income, here from around 0.15 to around 0.5, it basically corresponds to what we have on average around the Western world here as well. So very strong variation here, also within Denmark. Okay. So now we're going to do a very simple sequential decomposition. So just as an example, take the log of children's income regressed against the log of parents' income. So focusing on market income. Then we're going to condition on children's education. So basically what the difference between these two estimates is going to be the association between parents' log income, children's education, and then multiply by the returns to education. So then basically this will take away the variation that is relating to education. And going back to your question, Jim, this will both be the direct impact of education, but also the thing that relates to, say, employment via education. Then we can do the same thing for employment as well, and then that would be the additional part explained by employment rates of children. Okay. So this just shows the linear regressions. We'll do it by the local linear regressions instead. So we'll basically do this for different levels of parental income. Okay. So this was the figure you saw before, and now we'll just see which parts how this line is then explained by variation in children's employment, children's education, and then a residual, which we'll get back to in just a second. Okay. And this is what we find. So.
Can I take you back to those decompositions?
Yes.
The differences. So possibly some issues. So take the last fuller representation as potentially the data generation. Mm. Then the small model that doesn't have any covariates may appear to be estimating beta IGE with just log of parents' income, but its probability limit is in fact reflecting what is the full data generation process. So what these coefficients are estimating are not what they appear to be, depending on which one of these data generation processes you assume is actually generating the data. Mm. Do you see what I'm saying? It's the classic omitted variable thing. If probability limit of beta IG in the small model, it isn't beta IG for bivariate distribution of those two. It will in fact incorporate what is in the largest model, partial effects or additional effects.
But that's true.
It's an interpretation complication.
Yes, I agree. But I'll have to think more about how that then changes the interpretation. But thanks.
Okay. Rasmus, just following on that point.
Yeah.
If what you're really trying to do is kind of regression adjust the child's income. So you're going to say this is the part of the income that's not due to education, right? And some other factors. Let's just take education for the moment, that first decomposition. Then you ask, well, what is that? And it's not wealth, it's not decom. So what is it? I mean, this is just the return to raw labor. I mean, I guess in terms of the decomposition of what income flow does this correspond to? What kind of attribute is being priced here, or what?
Yeah. Okay. So if I can, so basically what you're asking here is, so you see that the three lines here, which make add up to this overall estimate. And this red line down here is the residual. And your question is then, what is that residual basically?
This is alleged. If you did this in a nonlinear way, then what you should do is you should get rid of all the effective income that arises from both employment and from education, which would include wages. So then what's left? Welfare payments or handouts or what? I'm not sure.
In fact, just following up on Jim's point, ironically, the fullest regression, where all the variables are included, is what is doing the job for you, because those effects are partial effects, given that there are other factors. So they are in fact doing the adjustment. That the biggest regression is doing what I believe you're after, rather than the differences between these regressions. That would be the whole purpose of running the large regression, right?
Yes.
To control for the effects of these other covariates.
Yeah, but it's doing it in a linear way. So I mean, I want to give it full play, be completely non-parametric on these two and see what's left over. Yeah. And then I'm not sure the exercise is meaningful, but.
No. So okay, but if it, so what in particular this red part, which is what is then, I mean, not explained by the regression so far. So what this will turn out to be is exactly the capital income. So this is exactly the income that is not relating to your employment, and it's not relating to your returns to education in terms of whether you have a job or anything. And this is then basically back to the wealth transfers between generations. So we've also looked into more and that is basically going to drive be sort of the last unexplained component here. So the green line here is then the part that relates to employment, and the blue line here is the part that relates to education, and then the red line here is then the residual. So what you can see here is that employment here, at least as we then conceptualize it, is that explains most of the association for low-income families, whereas it's education that explains most for high-income families. So there are two basic points to this. The first is that even though that you can see that
these are the coefficients, right?
Yeah. No. So these are the different. So this is basically. So this is the overall coefficient that you had, right? This was the figure.
Yeah.
And then this is then the difference. So this is then the difference between the overall coefficients and then what we get when we condition on education.
Right.
And then this is the difference between what we then have when we condition on education and then what we condition on employment. And then there's some residual left that we haven't explained here.
Rasmus, this is basically you're trying to decompose it into direct and indirect effects. Is that what you're trying to do?
Yeah.
But you're doing it using the nonlinear regression, not the linear one that you showed us before.
Yes. So I'm doing this as for, a local linear regressions in, this entire setup. Mm-hmm. So then I've run I don't know, 100 regressions or something like that.
Could you go back just one slide for just a second?
This?
Sorry, one more, the decomposition.
This.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the difference in the beta coefficient.
Yeah, so it's the difference between. Yeah. Okay.
But it might be informative to do a true mediation type analysis where you say, oh, now I'm going to look at the effect of this component, look at the effect of that component, right? And then what you're calling education is really education net of employment. You're also adjusting for employment simultaneously.
Yeah.
You're just citing Frick's law here.
No, but we have also done that, Jim. But that component is not in this figure here. That the education or through employment is not driving anything essential here. So that's
No,
so just to make.
Once you take care of it.
No, but it's just to Okay. So so 2 points. The first is that for low-income families, what we find is the mechanisms relating to the association between parents and children's income is quite different from what we have for high-income families. And then second, if we look at, say, the estimates for an area of disadvantaged families versus the estimates for an area affluent families, even though they overall look similar, then the underlying components of what explains that association is very, very different. So then say that I took for estimates across Denmark, for IGE estimates for different areas, and then try to see whether employment rates, education levels, what explains that. So in sort of a kitchen sink regression has been done in many studies now of regional variation in mobility. But because these factors, so both employment and education differs quite dramatically in terms of what they explain across the different margins, then I'm not necessarily going to get anything meaningful out of that comparison kitchen sink regression, even though that employment might be an important driver of the association between children's and parents' income for some families and education for others. So we have 4 questions here, and I'm going to consider only 2 of them now for the remaining of part of my presentation. So the first is this residual, and then the second is the idea of employment and education and how this picture changed when we include transfer income. Okay. So the figure I will show you now will show income levels of children by their parents' log income. So out of the x-axis, we have parents' log market income. And then out of the y-axis, we have children's market income. And note that it starts at 30 here. But what is important is going to be the gradients. So the yellow part here is wage earnings. Then the blue part is profits from businesses and self-employment income. And then the red part is then capital income. So you can see that wage earnings increase in parental income until the very top, where it's basically just flat. Profits from businesses, self-employment income is relatively constant until sort of the very top, where then increases mildly. Whereas capital income is basically non-existent for all regions except the very top, where then skyrockets. So what we'll do now is we'll again basically do this decomposition, where we then first take the overall IG estimate, and then we'll condition on the log of children's wage earnings. So we'll basically get an estimate that is reduced by the association between parents' log income and then children's log wage earnings. And then we'll do the same with log of wage earnings plus profits from businesses, etc. And then we'll basically see which parts of the IGEs that are then explained by wage earnings, profits for businesses, etc. for children. We have the first quartile for parents' income, and then the final quartile, split up in 2 groups. So the 75th to the 95th percentile, and then the top 5%. So as you've seen before, the overall estimates are roughly similar. So around 0.15, around 0.2. But what you can also see is that for children from low-income families, it's wage earnings that really explains the entire association, some self-employment income. Whereas when we get to children from high-income families, some wage earnings, more profit from businesses and self-employment income, but also emerging capital income here. And then finally, what we have here at the very top is that capital income basically explains everything. And that is the entire residual that you saw in the red line with the nonlinear plot to begin with. And this also shows that even though that we see estimates that are quite similar, the underlying things that drive these estimates are just very, very different. Okay, so what we'll talk about now here for the final part of the presentation is then transfers. So we can see that as we've also talked about, that a large part of this is employment, and as you also know about Denmark, is that transfers are generous, and basically if you don't have a job, then you are eligible for some transfers. And many, for instance, in terms of child benefits, also get transfers even if they have a job. So if we just for start look at this overall nonlinear IGE that you've seen before, and then instead of doing it with children's market income and parents' market income, we then consider children's gross income instead. Then this is what we get. So what we see is that, well, the estimates decrease overall, but they do so more in for children from low-income families. And basically what we will get is that this entire component that related to employment and education in the figure you saw just before with the green and the blue and the red line, that basically just goes to 0. So basically employment and also education explains nothing in terms of the IGE when we consider transfer income instead. Okay, so I don't know. So how much time do you have left?
I mean, if you could do like 2 minutes, that would be great.
2 minutes, okay. So then I'm gonna do this. So basically, this shows the estimates. We have then split the sample by quartiles. So the first quartile of parental income, the second quartile, and then the third, the crosses, the third and the fourth quartile of parental income together when we consider children's market income. And here we've conditioned basically on both their education and children's employment. Here we haven't conditioned on anything, but we considered instead children's gross income. And basically what you can see is that both, if we look at the differences across family income, but also look at the point estimates, they're almost identical. And the short version of that is that when we consider gross income when transfers are very generous, as in Denmark, what we get is basically equivalent to conditioning an income concept without transfers, but then conditioning on children's education and employment. So just to give you another illustration of that, we can consider then variations in terms of transfer levels. So again, this is by different parental income quartiles. And then we basically reduce transfer levels by a certain percentage. So it could be that we now compare Denmark, where transfers are very generous, to a country where transfers are less generous, say 20% of those they are in Denmark. And then we would basically just get estimates that were 50 to 75% higher, simply because the transfer level is different, even though we formally defined incomes the same way. Okay. So the final thing I'll just say in the last 30 seconds, if I do have those, is then gender differences and how that shapes results. So this shows the log-log plots of children's and parents' income by gender. So there are level differences, and I'm sure that we'll hear more about that in the presentation later today. But what is important here is the gradients in terms of parental income. So if we do the nonlinear regressions again, so the nonlinear IGEs for males and females separately, focusing on market income, this is what we find. So they're identical for children from low-income families, but there are substantial differences for children middle part of distributions and also some at the top. So this relates to education and also employment in the same way that we've talked about before. I'm just going to skip those and just going to get to the point that when we then consider transfer income, you can see that there are basically no differences between genders, basically because that mutes the role of employment and the role of education. So basically, the differences we have between these two groups when we consider market income, which are sizable, at least for some regions, are basically eliminated when we consider gross income, because what we do when we consider transfer, when we include transfer income, is basically eliminating the role that parents, or the influence that parents' income has on children's employment, and also to some extent their education. And I think that was my 2 minutes. So thank you so much for the questions and comments, and I'll be happy to hear if you have anything more.
Thanks so much, Rasmus. So people should, of course, ask questions, make comments.
Sorry, Rasmus. Sorry.
Go ahead, Steve. No, Stephen, please.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, I'm going to come back to taxes because I think you've got a very interesting result here about effectively the progressivity of transfers. And I expect that in Denmark, income taxes are particularly progressive as well. That's a guess. So I suspect if you were to add in taxes, you might in fact get a magnification of the picture that you're currently getting, and that would be very interesting to see. Second thing was just wondering where you're doing these sequential decompositions, whether or not the order in which you do them matters. Is there an actual ordering in these things? And thirdly, sorry, just a clarification point. When you talk about children's income, do you actually mean their own personal income from all sources? Are you referring to the income of the family or household within which they live?
Okay. So the ordering, yes. So that basically, I think, goes back to the first questions I had in terms of whether education should be, the role of education should include the role of education on employment, on income. So that component is basically driven by the ordering of that. So in that sense, if I redid the ordering, then that component will be shifted from education in my figure to employment. But since it's not a pivotal component of the result, then yes, it does matter in terms of the point estimates, but in terms of the qualitative conclusions, then not that much. We consider children's individual income. So of course, a separate question is then how this would look with family income, but then we would also have things like say assortative mating, and that would also vary across. Yeah, and it's not that it's not interesting. It's
their
not important.
individual income reflects their the joint decision of labour market and partnering choices. I would have thought so. There's
but yeah, sure. I mean,
particularly at that age,
it does certainly. But it's just this would give yet another margin of variation where we then also would have differences, say, between genders, and we would have different. And of course, as you say, we also have that implicitly here. But at least in terms of what we're then varying, we will get yet another dimension to this. Yeah. So it's not that it's not an important margin, and certainly we should include it in terms of seeing how results change, or if they do change, and why they then do or don't. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just to persist, but it doesn't transfers in most countries are done on a family or household means test basis rather than an individual one. So that sort of complicates the total income story as well, does it? Well, maybe I don't know about.
So the specific component called social assistance does, but otherwise no. So unemployment benefits is not means tested. Pensions, well, yes, retirement pensions are, but I guess that this is not really this age range.
I'm wondering if, as a sort of a robustness check, you could look at an alternative way of achieving the same thing. You could run quantile regressions here and graph the quantile slopes, IGEs, in the same fashion by quantiles and by covariate effects. A lot of the nonlinearities, it seems to be quantile driven, income quantile anyway. And so that would be a very easy way of doing it, taking care of both nonlinearity and speaking quantile to quantile. It would be attempting to do the same thing, but maybe with less doubt about what one is capturing. With quantiles, we know exactly what's being captured in a way. I'm not suggesting you would get different results, by the way.